In the final hours of the Third Reich, when Berlin was literally burning, when even the most loyal Nazi generals were fleeing for their lives, one man chose to run, not from the enemy, from Hitler himself. And that decision, that one desperate, human choice, would cost him everything. His name was Hermann Fegelein. And what happened to him in those last 48 hours is one of the most shocking, most personal, and most forgotten stories of World War II. April 1945. The Soviet Red Army had surrounded Berlin from every direction. The city was collapsing street by street, building by building. Inside the Führer bunker, that underground fortress buried beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler was losing his mind in real time. His generals were giving him bad news every hour. His empire, which was supposed to last 1,000 years, had lasted 12. And the man who had built it all on fear, loyalty, and absolute obedience was now watching it disintegrate. But here's what most people don't know. In the middle of all that chaos, the bombings, the Soviet artillery, the collapse of the entire Nazi command structure, Hitler found time to be personally betrayed, not by a general, not by a political rival, by his own brother-in-law. If you're new here, this is X-History. We don't just tell you what happened. We take you inside the moment, the emotion, the decision, the consequence. If that's the kind of history you want to understand at a deeper level, hit subscribe right now, because what we're about to uncover about Fegelein goes places most history channels won't touch. Let's get into it. To understand why Fegelein's execution hit so hard, even inside the bunker, you need to understand who he actually was. Hermann Fegelein was not a genius. He was not a great strategist. He was not even particularly brilliant, but he was something far more dangerous inside the Nazi hierarchy. He was charming. Born in 1906 in Bavaria, Fegelein grew up obsessed with horses. He became an expert equestrian, competing, winning, building a reputation. When the SS came calling, he joined, and he rose fast. Here's what made him different from the others. While most SS officers were rigid, cold, mechanical, Fegelein had a personality. He could walk into a room full of brutal men and make them laugh. He knew how to work people, how to smile at the right moment, how to disappear when the situation turned dangerous. That last skill, it would define his entire life. Fegelein's military career during the war was genuinely brutal. He commanded SS cavalry units on the Eastern Front, and those units committed some of the most horrific atrocities of the entire war. Mass killings of civilians, brutal anti-partisan operations in the Soviet Union and Poland. He was not a passive officer. He participated, he ordered, he was responsible. But the war was turning dark for Germany, and Fegelein, always watching, always calculating, made a move that would change his life completely. He got close to Heinrich Himmler. Himmler was the head of the SS, the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, and Fegelein positioned himself as Himmler's personal liaison to Hitler, his man inside the bunker. Think about that. This charming, horse-riding, socially gifted SS officer had just placed himself at the center of power in the entire Third Reich. And then he made an even bolder move. In 1944, Fegelein married Gretl Braun. Now, if that surname sounds familiar, it should. Gretl Braun was the younger sister of Eva Braun, and Eva Braun was Adolf Hitler's longtime companion and, in the final hours of his life, his wife. Let that sink in. Fegelein had just married into Hitler's inner personal circle. He wasn't just a senior SS officer anymore. He was practically family. People inside the bunker noticed the shift immediately. Fegelein's access to Hitler became almost unlimited. He dined with them. He attended private gatherings. He was inside the most protected social circle in Nazi Germany. And with that access came confidence. Too much confidence. People who knew Fegelein described him in ways that almost feel out of place in a World War II account. He was funny. He was loud. He liked to drink heavily. He chased women. He told jokes. He was, by many accounts, genuinely entertaining to be around. One historian described him as a man who treated the Nazi hierarchy like a social party he had somehow gotten himself invited to and decided to enjoy while it lasted. But Underneath that surface, there are accounts of cruelty, of cold, detached decision-making. When it came to orders on the Eastern Front, the charm was real, but so was the darkness beneath it. He was the kind of man who could make you laugh at dinner and sign a death order by morning. By April 1945, everyone inside the bunker knew the end was coming. Soviet forces were advancing on Berlin at a pace that made escape almost impossible. Generals were surrendering. Officers were fleeing west, hoping to fall into American hands rather than Soviet ones. The entire Nazi command was fracturing in real time. And Fegelein, the charming one, the social climber, the man who had always known when to disappear, was nowhere to be found. On April 27, 1945, someone noticed that Fegelein had not reported to the bunker. Hitler asked where he was. Nobody knew, and then the search began. What they found when they located Fegelein would shock even the hardened men of the fur bunker. He wasn't at the front. He wasn't captured. He wasn't dead. He was in his Berlin apartment. In civilian clothes, with packed bags, and a woman who was not his wife. Hitler's reaction when he heard was not what anyone expected. So let's set the scene. Berlin is burning. The Soviet army is closing in from every direction. Hitler is underground in a concrete bunker, running what's left of a collapsing empire on a map with units that no longer exist. And his brother-in-law, the charming, well-connected, personally trusted Hermann Fegelein, has vanished, not toward the enemy, not into combat. Into a Berlin apartment, with packed luggage, in civilian clothes, with another woman. If this were any other moment in history, this might almost be darkly funny. But this was the fur bunker, April 1945, and nothing that happened next was funny at all. When SS officers finally tracked Fegelein down, the scene they walked into told the whole story without a single word needing to be spoken. He had changed out of his uniform. He had packed valuables, including documents, cash, and jewelry that investigators would later describe as suspicious. The woman with him was not Gretl Braun, his pregnant wife sitting loyally back in the bunker. He was, by every visible measure, preparing to run. Now, desertion in Nazi Germany was not treated lightly even in normal circumstances. But this wasn't a regular soldier. This was a senior SS general, Himmler's personal liaison, a man with access to Hitler's inner circle, a man who knew things. The SS officers who found him had a problem on their hands. They brought him back to the bunker. And the moment he walked through that door, Fegelein's fate began moving in only one direction. Here's where the story gets deeply psychological. Hitler's initial reaction was not explosive rage. People in the bunker that night, including secretaries and aides who later gave testimony, described Hitler as something almost worse than angry. He was quiet, cold, focused. The man who had trusted Fegelein, who had welcomed him into his personal world, who had watched him marry Eva's sister, who had promoted him, protected him, given him access that very few people on Earth had, felt personally betrayed. And in Hitler's psychology, personal betrayal was the deepest possible wound. But here's what pushed the situation from bad to catastrophic for Fegelein. While he was being brought back to the bunker, news arrived that would detonate everything. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, the man Fegelein personally represented inside Hitler's circle, had been secretly negotiating with the Western Allies. Himmler had reached out to Count Folke Bernadotte of Sweden, offering a German surrender to the British and Americans without Hitler's knowledge, without Hitler's permission. It was, by any definition, treason at the highest possible level. And the news reached the bunker through a BBC radio broadcast. Hitler did not hear it from a general. He did not hear it in a briefing. He heard it on the radio. The humiliation of that moment cannot be overstated. Now connect the dots, because Hitler connected them instantly. Fegelein was Himmler's man. Fegelein had been inside the bunker every single day. Fegelein had access to Hitler's movements, plans, and state of mind. Fegelein had just been caught trying to flee in civilian clothes, with packed bags. In Hitler's mind, there was only one explanation. Fegelein knew. Whether he was directly involved in Himmler's secret negotiations or not almost stopped mattering. In that bunker, in that moment, with Berlin falling and betrayal coming from every direction, Fegelein represented everything that had gone wrong. He was the traitor in the room. He was the proof that even the people closest to Hitler could not be trusted. And he was right there, physically present, unable to escape. What followed was a military court-martial that lasted only a matter of hours. And the word trial is being used generously here. Fegelein was brought before a hastily assembled SS tribunal inside the bunker. The charges included desertion, theft of state property because of the valuables found in his apartment, and crucially, suspicion of involvement in Himmler's treason. Fegelein reportedly tried to defend himself. By some accounts, he was drunk, either from the alcohol he'd had in the apartment or from a desperate attempt to cope with what he clearly understood was happening. By other accounts, he was terrified and barely coherent. Eva Braun, his sister-in-law, the woman closest to Hitler, reportedly attempted to intervene. She was carrying his child, his wife Gretl. There was a human, personal connection that under any other circumstances might have saved him. But Eva Braun's influence over Hitler in that moment had limits, and Hitler was not in a forgiving state of mind. The tribunal's verdict was never really in doubt. Guilty. The sentence: death. Fegelein was stripped of his SS rank. Every insignia, every decoration, every symbol of the position he had spent years carefully climbing toward, removed. The man who had charmed his way through the Nazi hierarchy, who had married into the inner circle, who had survived the Eastern Front, the politics, the paranoia, was now just a man in a room, waiting. What happened in those hours between the verdict and the execution is one of the most haunting parts of this entire story. Fegelein was held inside the bunker. Above him, Berlin was being shelled continuously. The ground shook, the lights flickered. The world he had navigated so cleverly for so long was physically collapsing around him. There is no full record of what he said, thought, or did in those final hours, but the people who saw him described a man who had completely broken. The charm was gone. The confidence was gone. What was left was just fear. On the morning of April 29, 1945, the same day Hitler would marry Eva Braun in a small ceremony just meters away, Hermann Fegelein was taken outside into the ruins of the Reich Chancellery Garden. And the last thing he heard was a command being given. April 29, 1945. The same morning that Adolf Hitler was preparing to marry Eva Braun in a small, quiet ceremony inside the Fuhrer bunker, Hermann Fegelein was being walked out into the open air for the last time. Above ground, Berlin was unrecognizable. Buildings reduced to rubble, streets buried under debris, Soviet artillery firing so continuously that the ground never stopped shaking. The sky was orange and gray with smoke and fire, and in the garden of the Reich Chancellery, that once grand symbol of Nazi power, now half destroyed, a small group of SS men assembled. No crowd, no ceremony, no audience. Just a wall, a man, and a firing squad. Hermann Fegelein was shot by firing squad in the early hours of April 29, 1945. He was 39 years old, the man who had charmed generals and laughed at private dinners with Hitler, the man who had married into the most protected inner circle in Nazi Germany, the man who had survived the Eastern Front, the SS politics, the constant paranoia of bunker life, died in a bombed-out garden, stripped of his rank, condemned by the same system he had spent his entire adult life serving. There was no dignified last statement recorded, no famous final words, no moment of defiance. By multiple accounts, Fegelein did not die well. The charm that had carried him so far, it had nowhere left to go. Here is the detail that makes this story almost impossible to process. Emotionally. While Fegelein was being executed in the garden, inside the bunker, just meters away, Eva Braun was getting ready. Within hours of her brother-in-law's death, she would stand beside Adolf Hitler and become his wife in a brief civil ceremony. She would sign her name, starting to write Braun by habit before correcting it to Hitler. Gretl Braun, Fegelein's pregnant wife, was also present somewhere in that underground world. Two sisters, one losing a husband to a bullet outside, one gaining a husband in a ceremony inside, on the same morning, in the same building, in the same crumbling, burning, final chapter of the Third Reich. History rarely produces moments this simultaneously tragic and absurd. Now here is the question that historians have debated for decades. Was Hermann Fegelein actually involved in Himmler's secret peace negotiations? The honest answer is probably not directly. Most serious historians believe Fegelein's attempted desertion was personal, not political. He saw the end coming. He wanted to survive. He packed his bags, found a companion, and tried to disappear into a collapsing city before the Soviets arrived. That's not treason in the ideological sense. That's a frightened man making a desperate, human decision. But in the psychology of Hitler's final days, that distinction didn't matter. Fegelein was connected to Himmler. Fegelein had tried to run, and Hitler needed someone to punish. Fegelein was simply the man who was there. In dictatorships, being in the wrong place at the wrong moment can be just as fatal as actual guilt, sometimes more so. But step back from the individual story for a moment, because what Fegelein's execution actually reveals is something far larger than one man's fate. It shows us the internal logic of the Nazi system in its death spiral. This was a regime built on absolute loyalty, demanded from every level, punished with death when it wavered. And in the final days, that system began consuming its own people. Generals were accused of cowardice. Officers were executed for retreating. Men who had served for years were shot for making human decisions under inhuman pressure. The Third Reich didn't just kill its enemies. In the end, it killed itself from the inside. Fegelein wasn't a hero. He wasn't a victim of injustice in the traditional sense. He was a willing participant in one of history's most brutal regimes, and he committed genuine atrocities on the Eastern Front that history must never forget or minimize. But his execution tells us something real about what absolute power does to the people inside it. It makes everyone disposable, even family. After Fegelein's execution, the bunker moved fast toward its end. April 29th, Hitler married Eva Braun. He also dictated his final political testament, blaming the Jews for the war and expelling Himmler and Goering from the Nazi Party for their betrayals. April 30th, Soviet forces were fighting street by street, just blocks from the Chancellery. Hitler and Eva Braun said their goodbyes to the remaining staff, and in the early afternoon, Hitler shot himself. Eva Braun took cyanide. Their bodies were carried upstairs, soaked in petrol, and burned in the Chancellery garden, the same garden where Fegelein had been executed less than 24 hours earlier. The geography of those final hours is almost unbearable in its compression. So much death, so much history, in such a small, bombed-out space. Gretl Braun, Fegelein's widow, gave birth to their daughter just weeks after the war ended. The child, Eva Barbara Fegelein, was born into a world where her father was dead. Her aunt had poisoned herself, and the entire system that had defined her family's life had collapsed into rubble. Gretl lived until 1987. She rarely spoke publicly about her husband or the final days. Some silences carry more weight than any testimony could. Hermann Fegelein's story is not a redemption story. It is not a tragedy in the classical sense, because he made choices, real choices, that caused real suffering to real people long before those final hours in Berlin. But it is a deeply human story about what happens when a man builds his entire life on charm, access, and proximity to power, and then discovers that none of it was ever truly his. The uniform can be stripped away, the rank can be removed, the connections can disappear in a single moment of political crisis, and what's left underneath? Just a man, afraid, alone, in a garden full of smoke and ash. That is what absolute power looks like when it ends, not with glory, not with meaning. With a wall and a command and silence. If this story hit differently than what you expected, that's exactly what X history is here for. The history they summarized in one paragraph in your textbook. We go inside it. We find the human moment buried underneath the dates and the names and the official records. If you want more of that, subscribe. Leave a comment telling me which part of Fegelein's story shocked you the most. And if you want to go deeper into the final days of the Führer bunker, the next video is already waiting for you. I'll see you there.